morning.
Hi.
Hi, how are you doing, Alan?
Okay, not bad at all.
Great. Well, this is the first one of our breakfast streams. My name is Sonia Allen, and I'm the head of operations at Allen and Jones Consulting Partners. And I'm here with Alan Jones, who's the head of the team.
Yeah, so sorry, I was half asleep there, still enjoying my coffee. Yeah, so I look after Lean at AJC, and we were thinking that remote working is such a dramatic change to the way we work. We'd run a short talk about it and just see what we've learned from it.
Yes, and I think it was a steep learning curve, 2020, wasn't it?
It was rather, yes. It came as a dramatic shock to the world.
Yes, but the one thing that we did find is that in particular interventions that typically happen in a boardroom or on the shop floor, where you need flip charts and tools and all those bells and whistles that typically come with a lean intervention, people were quite apprehensive to move them remote, but eventually we had to. So really, that's what we're going to share today, our experiences from that.
Yeah. So the first thing that we learned really is that you've got to go back to first principles in this, and not run these sessions as adapted physical sessions. You have to think of it as, this is a remote session, this is what I do, and what are the principles that I'm trying to achieve.
I mean, I think this was the steepest learning curve for me. Do you remember when I was searching for about a week to find a remote big picture map?
Yes.
It doesn't work.
No, and it's a big picture map in itself does not fit on a small screen. So you've got to understand how are you going to get to understand the value stream of the client in a remote activity. Yeah. And you can't do that with a 10-meter long piece of paper. So
I miss 10-meter long pieces of paper. The other important element really is about flexing your diary. So and we're going to get in a lot more detail into that. But typically when you work as a consultant or when you deliver Kaizens, even internally, you have this massive chunk of time. So you're going to stop the operation more or less for 5 days, and you're going to lock yourselves in a meeting room with massive sheets of paper, and you're going to work out the value stream and the improvements and so on. That doesn't work remote. So you're going to have to adapt to the way people are used to remote working. And there's huge benefits to the client in doing so. And we're going to get into that a little bit later.
Yeah. I was thinking about this, and a typical event at a client, maybe in Europe, would involve drive, fly, drive, overnight stay, just to be physically present and have a significant disruption on the client. So getting rid of all that waste, we are lean consultants after all, it can only have upsides. And one of the biggest things for me when we started working remotely and thinking about coming back is not why would I continue to work remotely? It was, why would I need to go to the client? Start off with that, and then flexing the diary becomes a massive advantage for everyone then. So yeah, we'll go into that in more detail. Looking forward to that.
And the last and most important one is keep it simple. I've already referenced the bells and whistles that we all like as consultants, but many of them aren't appropriate when you work remote. So the simpler you can keep it, the better for everybody.
Yeah, I guess that's got something to do with the communication. It is more limited when you work remote, so simpler messages work better than complicated messages.
And the same goes for the tools and techniques you use. So, as consultants, whiteboards, flip charts are something that we use all the time. Technically, although they're available on many of the tools, they don't work that well. So I think that the simplicity comes in conversation first and foremost.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, shall we go on to the first one in more detail?
Yeah.
Okay, so going back to first principles, identify the value add for your customer. The very first lean principle. What does value adding mean for the customer? So this is going back as far as you can in terms of first principles. And it's a really good question to ask yourself, because I suppose we all do fall into a rut. We pitch up, we deliver our standard offerings, and here we are having to work remotely and redefine what we offer. So what is it that the client wants? Well, the client clearly wants a result. They want to have a change in the way they work. But they really want it with minimum disturbance to their business. If possible, they'd want a whole army of elves to come in overnight, make all the changes, and leave by the morning. To have very little disruption. Well, clearly a 5-day Kaizen doesn't deliver that. So going back to first principles, asking yourself those questions is really a fundamental prerequisite for such a big change.
I agree. And the other element that's where you should ask yourself what is the value add is what is the value add in remote working. So is there something that actually will give the client a better result than if you were on site? I guess that's in particular, for example, with the second principle, flex your diary. That is a real value add for the customer. So build that into your pitch.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of pitching, of course, I'm a project manager at heart and will always stay a project manager at heart. But focusing on the scoping of the activity is even more important when you work remotely. Be very, very clear about the value add and the scope of this value add. Scope creep is something that can happen really quickly in this different way of working, because you're developing a very different relationship with the client, a much more intimate relationship with the client. You're sort of becoming an extension of their team a lot more than you are when you go on site and you deliver a 5-day Kaizen, where you're largely looked at as a necessary interruption to the business.
Yeah. And within the scoping activity, of course, I guess this comes into your project management, it's much more important with remote working to scope out what the feedback will be to the client, to the senior managers, that rely on a much more prescribed type of feedback, rather than when you're on site, you can drop in. So the feedback changes from quite informal to quite formal. Very important, but if you've become used to the informal feedback, somehow you've lost sight of how important it is. Making it really formal is a good way. So the scoping activity and all the principles from project management really need to be built in.
It's the structures as well. So whether you manage your client contact over weekly or daily stand-ups. I think the core principle for me, which is why it's on the slide, is to value communication and collaboration over everything. So one of the principles of agile project management actually here. you have this distance, and if you communicate too much over email, if you communicate too much with pictures, you're going to lose the client. Keep as close as possible and as regular as possible in your communication with the client.
Yeah, certainly. Don't fall back on conversations which say, well, I refer to my email of the 3rd of last month, paragraph 4. If you're doing that, you've lost it. It's still got to be genuine person-to-person communication, even though it's happening through the ether, possibly with hundreds of miles separating you. Okay, shall we go on to flexing the diary?
I think those two actually go hand in hand. You know,
they do, don't they? Yes, yes. Because for me, flexing the diary and the benefit that brings for all sides is such a huge advantage that we would go back to first principles and then understand how we can maximize this flexibility of diary in order to deliver the customer value.
Exactly. And I think, the benefits to the client are huge for you to not be on site. We've already talked about the reduced disruption to the operation, but you can work with different teams as well. So typically when you were to run an improvement activity or Kaizen, you would get a group of skilled people and each brings something to the table. By flexing your diary, you can separate them out. So you have shorter, more pinpointed interaction with them. And you're not taking up as much of the operational resource. So for the client, that's a huge bonus. And typically shorter and more regular is better than scheduling like we would normally do in a lean improvement activity, full days. Nobody wants to sit in Microsoft Teams for a full day, ever. So use that to your advantage.
Yeah. It's often when we're on site, there are meetings taking place within the management structure, which we can't attend because we're there on the wrong day. So we get behaviors and outcomes reported back to us. By working remotely, we can actually be present at the time the meeting is taking place, so we can observe firsthand the behaviors that are being reported to us. It's a great advantage to have that. And of course, the disruption that we cause coming in versus the almost seamless integration that you can have through a virtual contact, joining a meeting, it's immeasurable.
And not just in terms of, influencing the culture change and the behaviors around that. It's in the relationship that you build with the client. So you sort of become an extension to their team. I'm just thinking of one of our current clients. I'm constantly WhatsApping with the guys. That we have a completely natural connection. So for you as a consultant or as somebody who's trying to bring about change within your organization, that's a huge advantage. The better the relationship, the more honest the team will be, the more they will bring you in, and the more they will allow you to influence.
Yeah, and I guess this comes back to the point you made on the first slide about first principles. You need to have a fairly good scoping document at the start. Otherwise, you will get integrated into the client's pressures, and we always have to remain alive to them, but separate from them.
Yes, I think that's a core skill to develop when you work remotely. So on the one hand, you want to develop this relationship and get closer to the client. On the other hand, you need to set your boundaries
Yes, yes, and they need to be present not just for us, but they also need to be clear for the client as well.
Yeah.
But the other thing I should mention, of course, is that there needs to be a separate system or a different system for measuring time increments, because time is a much smaller commodity now. Instead of counting days of contact or half days of contact, we're now counting hours of contact. So there needs to be better bookkeeping, I guess, on the part of the consulting organization. But again, the advantage of this is that the client gets a much more detailed view of what they're actually paying for. So,
and if you believe that as part of your reporting back to the client as well, so you could, for example, use again tools from Agile like a burn down chart.
Yeah.
Where you really give this clarity of this is what we agreed, this is what we've done, and this is what you've gotten, and this is what you're paying for. Clients love that.
Yes, yes. It's knowledge, good quality management information equals open working control, all positives. We'd encourage that. Okay, so keep it simple.
For me, that's the most important one. Right at the beginning, I referenced when we started bringing things that we would typically do on the shop floor into a remote environment. I fell into the trap I think most people will fall into, and I started looking online for all those elaborate tools and Kanbans and mapping tools and so on. And they, in our experience, in my experience, they don't work that well. Not only will you always have technical difficulties, it just becomes too complex in a virtual meeting environment. So the simpler you can get it, and the more then again you relate to the principle of what am I actually trying to do. So I want to value stream map the process. Do I need a big picture map, or do I need an Excel spreadsheet to capture the information?
Yeah. And how do I capture the information if I'm working intimately with a small client team? Then I don't need a big picture to produce that aha effect, because everybody is working on it at the time. It's not to say big picture maps will never be required, but it's I'm a great lover of them. But they have their place. They're not the go-to. They have their place. What struck me in the early days of lockdown and remote working is that we as an industry were looking for replacements to the physical activity. So I'm talking mainly about simulations, training activities, and the like. How can we take the physical into the virtual space? And with overwhelming evidence, the result was, well, we can't. There might be one or two things you can do, but essentially you can't take the simulations. The burden on technology is just too great.
I remember how we tested video games for training activities, like that little cooking game.
Yes.
That was awful.
We all burnt the food, yes. but the funny thing is that once we got over that, it didn't seem to provide, not having it was not a barrier. If I can use double negatives, I'm not sure, but it was not a barrier to success. It wasn't even a hindrance.
No, not at all. And I think this came through this refocusing exercise. So again, the going back to the first principle, and then scoping the activity in much smaller brackets, intimate teams, and really focusing on the quality of conversation in there. I mean, I have, in my previous career in corporate, I've always been told by my managers, you need to focus more on becoming a good listener. This stint into remote working as a consultant has really helped me to become a master listener. If you don't listen carefully and well, if you don't ask all the open questions and use your inquiry voice more than you ever have, you're probably not going to get as good results. But if you do, the results will be often better than what you would have gotten in a boardroom, is my experience.
And I think here the technology actually helps us, because in a live situation, you will have possibly multiple inputs at the same time. It's rare in a live situation that people will talk as nicely as they do on a video link. Because if multiple people talk on a video link, you just lose it. So people talk nicely. Now, what I find, and this is just my personal style, is that my note keeping is a lot better in virtual meetings as opposed to physical meetings, because there is less data coming through, which allows me to become a better listener, because there is an easier channel of input to focus on. So becoming a master listener, yes, absolutely prerequisite to success. But the environment in which we're working now, the video channels, actually help you to do that.
That's right. Yeah.
It's something I had not expected. The downside is I've got lots of paper here with lots of conversation notes on. But I think that's a nice way of keeping it simple, is having good quality conversations.
And another element of it is keeping it simple in terms of keeping it human. So what we've experienced is a good mix of people working from their homes and people working from the offices. Obviously, working in the manufacturing space with lean, you do get that mix. And that makes it quite human, and it makes it quite simple to build a connection. And again, that's an advantage. Don't pretend you are in a stiff boardroom. You're at home. Your dogs are going to be running around. Your children are going to be knocking on the door. Use that to your advantage and build a really human relationship with your client.
Yeah. I think if you put pressure on yourself to create an office environment at home, well, real life just gets in the way of that, and it creates unbelievable pressure for everybody.
Yeah.
So this is life. This is us, and we are real people.
Yeah. But in our experience, by bringing all these elements together, go back to first principles, understand the value for the customer, make sure you work with them. You're flexible, and more flexible than you ever have been, and keep it simple and keep it human. For us, that's worked incredibly well, and that is probably the most straightforward way that you can take typical lean and improvement activities and move them onto a remote environment.
Yeah, it's interesting when you put it together like this, you summarize it. It's not rocket science. It is good quality, solid basics being applied to an unusual situation, or what was hitherto unusual. And it works.
It works indeed. That's us for today. So thank you if you listened. This is the first in a series of breakfast talks. If there are any particular elements you want us to talk about, drop us a line on the AJC Partners Facebook, LinkedIn, or whatever. And we'll leave you with that. Thank you.
thank you very much. I hope you found it interesting.